So welcome. My name is Derek Mosley. I'm the Marquette Law Lubar Center Director. And I want to welcome you to our On the Issues program focused on the Marquette Law Poll. What's interesting is that from RNC in Milwaukee to DNC in Chicago to candidates flooding Wisconsin and probably will flood now for the next few days, to endless texts and mailings and door knocks. We're finally here for the last Marquette Law Poll before the November 5th election. As usual, I'm joined by Dr. Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law Poll. And Charles, you might not know this, but this is actually our 6th event you and I have done together for the poll.
How about that?
Yeah.
We're just getting started.
And they're still keeping us around, right? Yeah. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through the methodology to talk about, not the methodology, talk about what we're going to be talking about today, which will include the methodology. I'll also stop during periods of the program for questions that you might have. We used to let the questions wait until the end, but we think it's important to address those questions as they come up. But I will start just by saying, let's go through the topics of the day if we can real quick, Charles. So we're going to go through the methodology of the poll to give you a general idea of how we got here with these results. We're going to break down the presidential matchup. We're also going to go to the Senate race as well. Talk about early voting, which is a new topic that we really haven't discussed before. I think everybody's going to be surprised. There's a lot of new things, kind of like a micro poll, if you will, of things we're going to be discussing today. We're going to talk about individual group differences and how they tend to shift on different topics and how they're voting. And once again, as always, talk about enthusiasm.
That doesn't sound enthusiastic enough.
Well, I know you will jump into it, so I'm not worried about it. And then my favorite part, we're going to talk about the issues and the candidate images as far as the electorate is concerned. So at this point, Charles, I'll turn it over to you to discuss the methodology.
Okay. So here's our standard methodology now. The poll was in the field October 16th through the 24th. We interviewed 834 registered voters with a margin of error of plus or minus 4.4 percentage points. And there's 753 likely voters with a margin of error of plus or minus the same, 4.4 percentage points. We are using our new likely voter model, which is based on the voter list and how frequently people voted in recent elections, and then weighting everybody by their probability of voting. However, I can tell you that if we used our old method, which was just to use the people who say they're absolutely certain to vote, regardless of whether they have in fact voted in the past, the differences are in the tenths of 1%. And it doesn't change anything at the rounded 1% level. So there are some reasons to like this new method of weighting likely voters, but as a practical matter, nothing is different this time than it would have been if we had stuck with the old likely voter model. Partisan makeup. Always an interesting thing. This sample is 36 Republican, 31 Democrat, and 34 Independent. That is more Republican than our long-term margin, which has been 31 Republican, 29 Democrat, and 40 Independent. If you take those independents and ask which party are you closer to, which do you lean towards, then it's a 47 Republican, 42 Democratic sample with 11 Independent. And again, the long-term average is closer, 45 Republican, 44 Dem, and 10 Independent. Since we have been seeing these larger Republican margins recently, I thought it was worthwhile to show you the trend over the whole year. And while it is more Republican than it was in 2020 and 2022, the large part of the long-term average, you can see that we've actually seen this Republican advantage since the spring. It was tighter way back at the end of January, November of 2023, the far left there. But the margin has been relatively consistent since. In this last poll, Republicans are up a smidgen while Democrats are flat, and that's accounting for the difference that you see. Independents, as you can see down there in the gray, have been fairly flat the whole time, not moving much one way or another.
How far are we out?
6 days. Not that anybody is counting. I started to put up the slide with marking out 33, 32, 31, but we'll just, for brevity, go straight to the 6 days out. So it'll be all over but the shouting come a week from yesterday. Yep. There'll be a lot of shouting after, I'm pretty sure.
So where do we stand?
Where do we stand? We stand in a very close race. 50 for Harris, 49 for Trump. This is for likely voters. I'm going to focus for the vote on likely voters only. The registered voter numbers are practically the same, though. This is a little bit tighter than we were a month ago at the end of September when it was a 4-point Harris lead. So the race has tightened a little bit. If we include those folks who say they haven't decided, that's still only as small, but it's 5% who say, when we first ask them vote for Harris or Trump, they say, I haven't decided. But it doesn't shift the relative margin. It's still a 1-point margin between Harris and Trump. Now, obviously, that 5% undecided, when we then ask them, if you had to choose, how would you vote? That was the 50-49 margin with those folks included. So they really don't change the margin. They're not splitting heavily for one side or for the other. But it's still a much bigger percent undecided than the margin between the two candidates. So this is why there's still lots of room for uncertainty about how this race ultimately will turn out.
When we add other candidates, the multi-ballot?
Yep. So we do have 8 people on the ballot. If you look at the top line, it's now a 2-point margin for Harris with the third-party candidates included. The thing that's a little surprising to me is that the Kennedy vote actually went up this month from 3%, yeah, exactly, from 3% at the end of September and had been coming down steadily all year to now this little 2-point uptick. Now, maybe that's just noise. Maybe it reflects still some difficulty people are having in choosing between the two Democrat and Republican candidates. Oliver at 2% is doubling of his support last month when he was at 1%. But overall, we're at 9% saying they'd vote for a third-party candidate, though when they're pushed, they get to that 50-49 split. So I think one of the serious uncertainties is how many of this 9% stick with one of these third parties, how many of them choose not to vote, and how many of them decide to vote for either Harris or for Trump in the end. So again, as with that 5% who are undecided, this 9% that say, oh, I'd kind of like to vote for one of these third-party candidates, they could so easily tip this race one way or the other. If I haven't made it clear by now, let me just say it again. It should not surprise anyone if Donald Trump wins, and it should not surprise anyone if Kamala Harris wins, because the polling, both ours and the polling averages for the state, which is under a 1% average margin right now, are just so close that polling is not going to help us at all to have confidence in who's the likely winner.
Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, but I think it's important that we talk about the trends from the beginning.
Yeah, here's the trend over the whole time, including when Biden was the candidate off to the left. And what you can see is this has been a nip and tuck race where Trump led at some points in the spring against Biden. Harris has led with likely voters, which is what this is, since she got in the race. But actually in that first poll with her in the race, Trump led by a point among registered voters. So we've really seen a back and forth between them. This is noticeably different from in 2016 and 2020 when we saw Democratic leads the whole time, erroneously in 2016, but correctly, though, by a bigger margin in 2020. So tight. I guess we've been really consistent in making that point to everybody.
Now, before we move on, are there any questions in regards to the first few slides that we've gone through? 1 second, we'll have the microphone out.
Dr. Franklin, over the years, I've heard a number of African-American women say that they faced more discrimination because of their gender as opposed to their race. I thought of that this morning when I was reading the lead story in the Journal Sentinel on African-American voters. It was really very well done. One of the places they went to was a barber shop. What better place to go to get a lay of the land than the barber shop? But it's a well-known barber shop on King Drive, G's Clippers. And the owner, G. Smith, has said more than a few people have told him that they will not vote for a woman to be president. How widespread is this? Has there been any polling on this?
I have no polling on that specific issue. We will talk about gender and race in a little bit, so let me postpone to that.
Noting your party affiliation leans, seems to be slightly but increasingly Republican. Do you think that shows that that is a real trend among the Wisconsin population?
Well, in terms of our data, yes, that's what we've seen, except for that first poll or two, we've seen this Republican advantage. I think you can argue it without being able to answer the question. The polling data, our polling data has been pretty clear that GOP advantage that we've seen for a number of years, but seen it at 1 or 2 point advantage, looks a little bigger this year. You can contrast that with the election results since 2016, where Democrats have generally won by modest but consistent margins in the state. Since we don't have party registration on the voting file, there's no way to actually know what's going on other than the polling data. And of course, we'll find out in 7 days whether the poll was accurate or not.
And just to pub our colleague, Craig Gilbert, there's an excellent article in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel today that Craig does about that same breakdown that you asked about, Art.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, no, okay. We'll go on. Let's move on to the Senate race.
Okay. So in the Senate race, we have Baldwin at 51, Hovde at 49, a 2-point race. This is tighter than the 7 points we had with Baldwin leading a month ago. It coincidentally matches what Baldwin's internal polling was said a couple of weeks ago, and a tightening of the race in other polls in the state over the last month or so. That is, again, with likely voters. When we look at the undecideds in the race, there's 7% undecided, and it's a 3-point Baldwin lead, so a little bit bigger with undecideds. That, again, suggests that undecideds are slightly leaning to Hovde, bringing the margin a little tighter when we push them to choose a candidate. But a close race for sure. And that seems in keeping, as I said, with what Baldwin has said her internal polling is showing, and the other polls in the state that have shown the race tightening over the course of the fall.
Now, how about the trends in regards to the Hovde-Baldwin race?
Here you can see, first of all, look at the gray bar line down at the bottom, the declining percent of undecideds. People were relatively undecided. About 15% of likely voters were undecided back in April, and that's down to this 7% now. And you can see in some ways the race has been tightening for a while. It was a little close in our first April poll here. Widened a little bit in June, but it's been getting a little bit tighter in the subsequent polls. And now this down to this 3 points with undecideds included, 2 points with without undecideds.
And in the Senate race, will we add other candidates?
Yeah, it makes little difference here. It's 49-47 when we include Phil Anderson and Leaguer. 2 points and 1 point for each of them, but it doesn't seem to be shifting the margin between the two Democrat and Republican candidates at the top line.
Now, this is a new category for the poll, and this has to do with voting. Tell us about it.
Yes, with the rise of absentee and early voting, which you know, maybe it's hard to remember, but back in 2016 and before, Wisconsin was not a particularly early voting state. We had absentee voting, of course, but it was not a huge thing. It really, of course, exploded during the pandemic. And during the pandemic, we saw the big difference between Election Day and absentee votes. So that looks to be very much the case this year as well. At the top among people who say they've either already voted absentee by mail or they plan to vote absentee by mail, it's Trump 30 and Harris 70. That's a pretty big gap. Then among those voting early but in person, it's Trump with a 5-point lead, 52-47. And of those who say they will vote in person on Election Day, it's Trump with a 12-point lead, 56-44. So a moderate number of people have voted early already in our sample. In terms of what the Elections Commission reports, we're at about 1 million early votes. Roughly half of those are absentee by mail, and half of them are in-person early votes. It's hard to know how those are leaning, but if you go by the polling data, you can see that we expect a big difference by the time this is all over. And as a practical matter, it does mean that once again, we should expect the early count of returns from precincts, which are primarily in person, to lean Republican. We should expect the late absentee votes to lean Democratic, possibly very heavily Democratic if you take that top line number here. So we will probably see shifts through the election counting processes as this imbalance between Election Day preferences and early vote, and especially absentee by mail early vote happens.
So who does the electorate think is going to win the election?
Well, good question. On balance, they still think Harris will win, 45%, 37% think Trump. But, as you've heard me say, the people with the right answer, 17%, say they don't know. Interestingly, that's up from last time, and here's the trend on that. You can see that Harris is, well, first of all, when Harris first got in, more people thought Trump would win. Then we had 2 polls where she was expected to win, and she just barely touched 50% at the end of September, but now drops off. Trump has dropped off just a little bit since the end of September, and it's all being made up by that gray bar turning up, the people going from thinking they know the winner to saying that they don't know. That seems to me an appropriate amount of uncertainty about the outcome.
And because we've been polling on this next slide for a year now, how's Biden's job approval rating?
We're going to shift over the next several slides to talking about some fundamentals of the race that are shaping this. So while we'll talk individually about Biden's approval and Trump's approval, the background of this is what are the elements that have shaped the race at a sort of fundamental level, not the who said what on any given day, but enduring aspects of the campaign. And this is Biden's job approval. The green line is his approval ratings. And you can just see how negative those have been, fluctuating only slightly between 40 and maybe 42% job approval, with high 50s, 57, 58, 59 disapprove. And there's really been no trend in this that you can see there wasn't any shift once he dropped out of the race. So these negative views of his administration would be a burden on any candidate trying to keep the White House following an unpopular administration of their party. Now, the fact that Harris is the vice president, of course, makes that more of a complication. But the bigger point is a president who has gone through his term, except for the first year, with approval ratings in the low 40s here in Wisconsin, high 30s in the nation for the most part, is just a significant burden on their party in seeking the next presidency. If we look at Trump, let's go back and forth between those. Here's Biden and here's Trump. Now, this is the question of looking back on when he was president. Do you approve or disapprove of the job he did? And this is running at 52-47, 52 disapprove, 47 approve. You can see there hadn't been a lot of movement in that over this year either. But it turns out that that 52-47 disapproval is exactly the same as it was in our last poll before the 2020 election. There's been a lot of talk about people with rosy remembrances of the Trump administration and so on. I don't see it in our data. In fact, what we see is people's recollection of how they felt, or evaluation of how it was, actually matches nearly perfectly what they said at the time in 2020. A little bit negative, but not nearly as negative as the evaluation of Joe Biden right now. And so that is, relatively speaking, an advantage to Republicans that their nominee is negative, but not as negative as Biden has been all year long.
But to reinforce this point, this next series of slides talks about family financial situations.
Yeah. We ask in almost every poll, how is your family doing financially? Are you living comfortably? Are you just getting by? Or are you struggling? Now, this is a subjective measure, obviously, but we ask about it your family finances to make it a little closer to home rather than a broad view of the economy, which is amorphous and not something you directly experience at your dinner table. But here's the trend in that since 2016 rather. And the main point here is if you look at the entire Trump administration, the percent saying they were living comfortably was around 60%, a little up, a little down. Interestingly, notice it didn't dip during the pandemic. You know, unemployment went way up, GDP went way down, but that was short term. And in our surveys during 2020, we just didn't see people saying they were more likely to be struggling or not living comfortably. When Biden takes office in the summer of 2021, it remains at around 60% living comfortably. But after that is when inflation hits and views become decidedly less positive. And you can see the green line generally trending down since early 2022. And in the last year, it's fluctuated between 45 and 50, but it's been more often around 45% living comfortably. So we're looking at about a 15-point decline in people's sense of their family's financial situation. So back to that previous slide of Trump's job approval, if people are in fact mentally thinking about how I am now and how I was 4 years ago, I think this chart is a good explanation of why people are feeling more negative about their personal situation now than they were.
Now, these are the slides we talked about, this micro polling that we haven't done before.
Yeah. To be clear, we've always asked about what group you're in, but what we're doing this time, this is something of looking at the crosstabs. It's become a little bit of a sport on the internet to look at the crosstab and find some little group that doesn't make sense and make a big deal about that. The trouble is that by definition, a crosstab is breaking down the whole sample into all the little demographic groups. And necessarily each one of those groups has a much bigger margin for error than the overall sample. So the result is those crosstab numbers can bounce around a lot from one sample to the next. I learned this to my dismay back in 2012 when I was a wee lad doing polling here, that if you write about the crosstab in 1 month and there's a big interesting finding, and then the next poll, that interesting finding has completely evaporated, do you write a follow-on story saying, and now that big thing is evaporated, when it might possibly reappear a month later? And so as a result, I've been very reluctant to treat you to a whole lot of crosstabs. They're all on our website, so you can go indulge yourself if you want. But I think it has been a perilous thing to make a big deal of individual numbers in individual polls. So what we're doing here is we're pooling the last 4 polls, all 4 polls since Harris entered the race. In that pooled sample, she has a 2-point lead instead of a 1-point lead. So there's sort of a trivial difference between the pooled sample and our latest results, but you should know that they're slightly different. But this means that we can now look at the crosstabs using close to 4,000 respondents over the 4 polls instead of just 900 or so in the individual polls. So with that warning, here's what we see about the differences in groups. Let me help you read this. At the top is the most pro-Trump group of all these groups that you see on the left. So this is for religion, born-again Protestants, 20% for Harris, 80% for Trump. Huge gap. Then as you come down, the next group is rural and small town residents. 38 for Harris, 61 for Trump. And so on down the list. Then as you get down to the bottom part, you move to the groups where Harris is favored, getting better. If you go at the very bottom for black respondents, 18% for Trump, 82% for Harris. Then the religious nuns, those with no religion, 24 for Harris, 75 for Trump. And city dwellers, principal city basically means the major cities. It includes like Green Bay and Appleton and Madison and Milwaukee and La Crosse, for example. 32 for Trump, 68 for Harris. So you can see that across our demographic divides, if you will, you can find some groups that are overwhelmingly Trump and some that are overwhelmingly Harris. And then finally, those interesting ones that are really close. So among all white voters, it's 49 Harris, 50 Trump. Among Protestants, but not born-again Protestants, 50-50. Among 30 to 44-year-olds, 50-50. Among those 60 and over, 49 Trump, 51 Harris. And you can also see a small Harris lead with Hispanic voters right after that. So the point here is, oh, and I should mention it because we're going to get to it in more, the gender female, 43 for Trump, 57 for Harris. And if you look towards the top, gender male, 44 for Harris, 56 for Trump. That's the gender gap that we've heard so much about and that we're going to say more about in just a second.
So let me see if I have this right. So according to this, I'm just doing this quickly. So the Trump voters are white males, 45 to 59, no college degree, rural, and born again.
Yep.
And then Harris, BIPOC, female, 18 to 29, a big group, urban, college educated, but not overly religious.
Nailed it.
Man, look at that. Whew.
Maybe you should just do these.
Yeah.
I can sit in the audience and ask questions. Yeah, so that's I think as you go through this, it's all in the press release and it's on the website so you can look at it to your heart's content. I think these groups largely make sense. For those groups that are close to 50-50, you might give them special attention because they could shift one way or another between now and Election Day. So I'd pay attention to that.
And let's talk about the gender gap, because you just mentioned it.
So again, there's been an enormous amount said about the gender gap. In our data, it's large, but not enormously large. The gap between the Trump lead among men and the Harris lead among women, that gap is 26 points between the two. It was 21 points when Biden was the candidate. So you can see that the shift from Biden to Harris produced about a 5-point gain in that gender gap. But it was 30 points in 2016, and it was actually 32 points in 2020. And so it's not uniquely the largest gender gap we've ever seen. I've read that lead in stories for a while now. And for individual pollsters, maybe that's true. I'm just telling you what we've seen in Wisconsin in our polling, and it was even smaller in 2012, by the way. So over the course of our presidential polling, this is a substantial gap, considerably bigger than 2012, but a little bit smaller than either 16 or 20, and still worth paying attention to. What I want to show you, and this one's I want everybody to take a deep breath because this one's going to be hard to read. Okay? There. Shocking, right? I told you, take a deep breath. There is reason to this madness, though. At the very top is the group with the smallest gender gap of all these groups, and that's rural and small town residents, where the gap itself is tiny, and actually women are slightly more pro-Trump than men are, okay? Just slightly. Then born-again Protestants is a small but slightly larger gap. As you go down, the gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, so that at the very bottom, those 45 to 59 have the single biggest gap of 50 points between men and women in roughly Gen X. But the green dots for women are to the right, that is to say more Democratic, in every single group except for those rural and small town residents at the very top. And so the gender gap, my point is pervasive across all of our demographic groups. Sometimes it's bigger and sometimes it's smaller. It's actually relatively small for people 60 and over, but it's quite large for people under 30. And as I said, it's really large for that 45 to 59 age group. When we look, I want to point to education. For non-college education is sort of in the middle here. And for that, men are 20 points favoring Trump. Women are +2 for Harris. And if we look at college educated, college men are at 0, dead even between the two candidates, whereas the college women are at +36 for Harris. So we've got an interesting pattern of the non-college men being very heavily Trump, non-college women evenly split, college men evenly split, college women very heavily pro-Harris. So another thing to wonder about on election night and in the exit polls is going to be those two middle groups. Do non-college women end up voting more for Trump like their male counterparts? Do the college men end up voting more for Harris like their female counterparts? Or do they continue to just split their votes? So gender gap is a huge thing. It's a consistent thing across these groups, but it's not the dominant or the only difference that we see. It's just really striking how consistently gender plays a role in people's voting choices, no matter what demographic group they happen to fall in.
And this is off our information here, but as a Gen Xer,
not to pick on you, man.
Yeah, you're coming kind of hard on us. But as a Gen Xer, why do you think there is that gap?
One of the things we've seen looking at generations is that the Gen X generation is consistently the most Republican of any of the age groups. There's a little bit of a U-shaped curve where the youngest are quite Democratic or liberal, drops off a bit in the 30s, that sort of older millennial group. And then when you get to Gen X, it's the most Republican group. And then the geezers, my people, are a little bit more Democratic. Okay? Summer of love, man. Peace, love, dope. And that pattern has shown up all year. Now, the 60 and over are about evenly split. It's not like they're raging Democrats overall, but they are more Democratic than that slightly younger group. And I think a big chunk of it actually is old-fashioned political socialization. Gen X largely came of age during the Reagan years, especially the latter 6 years of the Reagan administration, which were good economic times as opposed to the first 2 years. And I think there is every reason to believe there's an enduring imprint of that that has really carried with that generation throughout its lifespan.
All right, let's talk about your favorite topic, enthusiasm.
And I just can't.
Are we entertained, Charles?
No, I can't get up for it anymore. I've had enough of it. Yes, we are still enthusiastic, though we're not much more than we were last time. The green line here is this year. The purple line is 2020. You can see we were well below 2020 levels through the spring. That changed when Biden dropped out. And last poll, we were just a smidgen above where we had been in 2020. This time, we're just barely a smidgen below 2020 levels. The most important thing is thinking about turnout. 2020 set records for turnout. It would be hard to reach those levels again because breaking a record every time is hard. But I think with this level of enthusiasm, we do have some reason to believe that we should expect to see turnout close to the 3.3 million we saw last time, maybe a shade higher, maybe a shade lower. But if you had asked me this in February, for example, we were so much less enthusiastic, I would have doubted we would get back to those levels. There is one little thing that's happening, and that is Democratic enthusiasm, the blue line, has really shot up. Republican enthusiasm has been gaining all year, but compared to the last month's poll, Democrats have ticked up a little bit while Republicans have stayed flat or gone down 1 point. So what was not much of a Democratic advantage last month is a slightly bigger Democratic advantage this time, but small. We're talking about 5 or 6 points difference, not a lot. What is puzzling and may have implications for turnout are independents, the gray line, which had been unenthusiastic all year, but bumped up to 50% last month, only to now fall back into the mid-30s this time. That could have ramifications for turnout. These folks don't seem to have. I thought last month that I could say, okay, they're catching on, they're tuning into the race, they'll go up again next time. Well, they didn't go up this time. So that could hold down turnout a little bit. It could also be one of the reasons we saw a slight upturn in third-party voting is less enthusiastic people looking for an alternative, thinking about something other than the main party candidates. And then the last thing is, we had seen a big split on the vote by enthusiasm, but what you see now is really a very modest split. Harris leads by 1 point among the very or somewhat enthusiastic. She leads by 4 among the not too or not at all enthusiastic. But if you remember a few months ago when I'd show you these slides, we were seeing like 60-point differences between the enthusiastic and the not enthusiastic. So I think that's just the leveling out of enthusiasm, especially for both parties, but with this little bit of decline for independents.
How about the favorability of our candidates?
Trump's favorability has generally gotten a little better over the course of the year, but not by a lot. But here in this last round, it slipped a little bit. Slight upturn in unfavorable, slight downturn in favorable. So he's a net negative by, I think it's 13 points. You'll see that table in a second. So not a lot of dynamic, but also something that we usually see at the end of campaigns. Negative advertising floods the airwaves, and we decide we don't like either of these people. You can see that with Harris in the next slide, where she too has slipped a little bit, a little more unfavorables, pretty much flat on favorables. And basically now everybody has an opinion of her just as everybody has an opinion of Trump. That's not a difference anymore. This is still much better for Harris than it was in the spring. We don't have a Wisconsin poll in the spring, but our national polling from the spring does have her and shows what a big uptick favorability took for her. But she's still a little bit underwater. Here's the table of everybody. So she's slipped to -5. I think she was a -3 last time. Trump is at -14. I think I said 13, but it's 14. He was -11 a month ago. Vance has actually improved to -4, a significant improvement for him. And Walz has slipped by about 7 points from being the only one with a positive rating at +7 to now a dead even at net 0. And all the third-party candidates are net negative, and if you look to the far right, you can see that most of them are hardly known among the public.
The Jill Stein one stands out.
Yeah, first of all, more people know her than know the other third-party candidates. She's been talked about. She's been on our ballot for multiple elections. But it is notable that with that greater knowledge of her, it's her unfavorable ratings that are considerably higher, rather than, say, splitting the difference between favorable and unfavorable. Images.
Yes, this is my favorite.
Okay, your favorite. Well, so as we talk about this, I want to go back to what I was saying about fundamentals. So earlier, I've stressed that Biden is not very popular. Trump is not popular, but less unpopular than Biden. That people's financial situations seem worse to them now than they seemed 4 years ago. All of those things are advantages to the Republicans and to Donald Trump. But on personal issues, Harris has the advantage. And here you see them. So the first two, where Trump has got the biggest scores, those are negative scores. 57% say he's too old to be president. Hardly anybody says that of Harris. 62% say he's behaved corruptly. 35% say that of Harris. So those are two negatives for Trump, with really large percentages saying that attribute applies to them. Where he has some still strength is in being seen as having a strong record of accomplishment, where he's got an 8-point advantage over Harris and a small 5-point advantage on being seen as a strong leader. But those are the only two positive attributes that he has a clear advantage on. When you go to shares your values, they're very close. Harris just slightly higher at 50-47. But on intelligence, she has a 6-point advantage. On honesty, a 10-point advantage. And on has the right temperament, an 11-point advantage. So here, if you thought we were voting purely on personality, we just looked at the favorability. Her favorability is -5 to his -14, so she's 9 points better off on that. And on this set of attributes, 2 of them are positive for Trump, but all the rest are more positive for Harris. And so if it were just a vote on those personal characteristics, she would have the advantage. Also, these images of the candidates have barely changed since she became the candidate. And so they haven't been moved very much by the campaign and the advertising and the speeches.
All right, national issues.
So this is where it's a split decision. And again, these haven't changed very much. I thought about showing you trends over time on these, but there's so little trend on any of them, it's just sort of a waste to turn them into a slide. Trump has always had the advantage on immigration and border security. He's always had the advantage on the Israel-Hamas war. He's always had the advantage on the economy. And he's always had at least a small advantage on foreign relations. Those haven't changed very much. With Harris, some of those tightened a little bit. Trump's advantage on the economy was about 15 points over Biden. Last month, it was about 8 points with Harris. This time, it's 10 points with Harris, so a slightly bigger Trump advantage on the economy, but not much change. But then Harris has this consistent advantage on handling Medicare and Social Security, health care, ensuring fair elections, and an especially large advantage on abortion policy. That same set of items also favored Biden. So the shape of the issue environment hasn't changed. The margins on them have moved a little bit. But then the next thing is, which of those is the most important to you? And the economy just stands out as the most important at 38% now. That's up from about 31% in April, so there's been some growth in that. Abortion policy second at 15. That has barely changed all year. It was 13 in April, it's 15 now, and has been 15 for the last several polls. But immigration and border security is at 13. That's down from about 21 in the spring. So there has been a little decline in concern for immigration, a little bit of an increase in concern for the economy, no change in abortion policy. And the others have remained in the single digits, as you see here, without much change over the course of the year. When we look at the partisan differences, those haven't changed much either. Republicans still put the economy far and away most important and immigration second. Democrats put abortion first, but the economy is a close second. But independents put economy number one for them, an important point. In the last couple of polls, we've seen independents put Medicare and Social Security as number two. This time it's healthcare as number two, and Medicare has dropped down to just 5% picking that. I don't know if that's noise or a substantive change, but even if it's healthcare, it's a different number two for independents than it is for either Democrats or Republicans. So that's a range of issues. Now, the last thing we do is we look at what issue did the person say was most important to them, and which candidate did they say is better on that particular issue. So if you pick the economy, we look at Harris versus Trump on the economy. If you pick abortion, Harris versus Trump on abortion. So when we do that for the respondents' most important issue, 43% prefer Harris, 56% prefer Trump. So on
47.
46.
47.
Yeah, 43 Harris, 46 Trump. So a small Trump advantage on issues. A lot of that, though, is coming fairly obviously because of the economy and how many people pick that is most important. 2% say they don't see a difference, or 5% say neither would be good on that issue, and 4% say no issue is important to me. So coming back to this point, if you look at how the conditions of the country and the previous administration go, those favor Trump. If you look at personality, most of those favor Harris. If you look at issues, it's a split. But when you look at the single most important issue to people, it's a slight Trump advantage. So that kind of explains why we have such a close race, doesn't it? There's not everything pushing in one direction or the other. It's really people being pushed in different directions, and of course, a big partisan divide in what we think is important and who we like and don't like.
So let's break it down, favorability with the Senate candidates, please.
Yep. Baldwin has slipped just slightly to a net -5 on favorability. Hovde slipped 3 points from -9 to -12. Again, if you've watched any advertising, there's a fair bit of negative ads out there in this race. Makes sense that both of them have become a little bit more negative. If we look at the trend over time, Baldwin has been really pretty stable, but now there's this little separation right at the end. And if we look at Hovde, he's been more unfavorable than favorable the whole time. He closed that gap a little bit, but now it's slightly widened. With him, though, it's the gray line of people who didn't know him earlier have come to know him, and he's now quite well known, though in the last couple of polls he hadn't been picking up people who know him quite at the same rate that he was. The net effect, of course, is that both of them are a little bit underwater. He's a little bit more underwater than she is. Now we ask about the three traits of these, and there has been a little change here. We ask of Baldwin and Hovde, how well does the phrase describe they will work to solve our national problems? This had been about a 4-point advantage for Baldwin in the last poll. It's now a 1-point advantage for Hovde in this poll, so a little bit of change there. Is committed to serving the interests of Wisconsin. She has a 4-point lead on this now, but it was as much as a 9-point lead earlier, so that one has tightened. And finally, cares about people like me. She has a 5-point advantage on that, again, tighter than I think it was 7 or 8 in one of the previous polls. So the race is tightening in these perceptions of the two candidates as well.
Finally, let's quickly talk about the state.
Okay. Right direction, wrong track. The purple is wrong track. It has come down a bit over the year, and right direction has gone up, but we're still pessimistic. We're still more wrong track than right direction. And the last couple of polls have seen it get a little bit worse, a little bit more pessimistic. I'm trying to get through these. So this is one, though, that I wanted to make sure we got to. This is, the green line is you're more concerned with reducing property taxes. The purple line is more concerned with increasing funding for public schools. And this has been quite a roller coaster over the last 12 years. Back in 2013, people were slightly more concerned about property taxes than with school funding. But then as budget cuts came in and the budget proposal in 2015 was made, we saw that sharply reverse with more support for funding, less concern about property taxes. And that margin grew through 2018. But it started to tighten in the latter part of 2018, and it tightened steadily from 2019 to 2023. But beginning in 2023 or late 22, those lines crossed so that now consistently more people say they're concerned with property taxes than say they're concerned with school funding. We have a lot of referenda on school ballots this year and this next week, and we're certainly going to have a legislative session coming in the spring. So while we all care about the horse race, I just thought it was important to set the stage for the coming legislative session, for these upcoming ballot initiatives, and these really pretty substantial changes that have occurred somewhat gradually month to month, year to year, but collectively have changed quite a lot since 2018. Evers' job approval had ticked down below 50% last month, but it's ticked back up to 51% this month. He remains, by being over 50%, the most popular politician in the state. But 51 used to not be something to crow about, but I guess these days it's pretty good. It does show that last month's dip doesn't seem to be the beginning of a new trend since it bounced right back up. And Ron Johnson has gotten a little more favorable these days. He's been net negative for a while, which is fairly common for him between elections. His election campaigns have successfully won him re-election, so these change as we get into the campaigns. But after being sort of steadily negative by a fair amount during the first half of the year, you can see those margins have closed a little bit over the last 3 polls. Still a little bit more net negative than Baldwin is at this point, but less of a gap than was the case a month ago.
Before we open it up to questions, is there any piece of advice, any words of wisdom you would like to give to our audience?
There might be one. This is the traditional close of the last poll before the election. Polls don't vote. For God's sake, the election is in your hands. Go vote. I don't care who you vote for, but the democracy works because people participate. So please vote. By the way, I'm wearing these socks today. So I'm putting my foot where my mouth is here. But I appreciate y'all. Thanks for coming, and thanks for being regular guests here. Now,
any questions? Oh,
Shell asked who's going to win. I'll give you the answer to that. It's the same one. Give me a quarter and I'll flip it for you. I don't think there is anything in my polls or the other polls that we've seen that can reliably answer that question, both in the popular vote and in the Electoral College. So many states are within literally tenths of a point in the average of the polls that if you're betting a state's going to go one way because somebody's ahead by literally 2/10 of a point, oh my goodness, I've got a bridge to sell you. Okay, so sorry, you're just going to have to wait like all of us until Wednesday morning, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And we'll see. But I just don't think that the forecasting game is worth the candle this year.
So democracy wasn't an important question for anyone?
We asked ensuring free and fair elections. That's in the chart. It's in the 5% range. It has not risen above that. Now, for Democrats, they put it in, I think, third or fourth place. So there are some partisan differences there. But we ask it as ensuring free and fair elections. Others say protecting democracy and things like that. So this is something where how you word the question can make a difference for your answers. But mostly they're big partisan differences. Suspicion about whether the election will be accurate remains substantial. About 34, 35% say they are not too confident or not at all confident that the election will be accurate. But that's about where it was for the 2020 election as well. And there's a big partisan gap. Republicans are more doubtful than Democrats are. But we've seen almost no change in those opinions over the last 4 years.
Yeah, I want to go back to a process question in terms of how you selected or why you selected the proportion of Republicans, it being going from 51 to 55% compared to the last few polls that you had taken. And I believe you said that was of little change. I don't know, my quick math says 4% increases, and I mean 4 percentage point increases like 8%.
Well, let's put the numbers back up because I didn't say 55% at all. So it's 36-31 without leaners, and it's 47-42 with leaners. I don't pick that number. It's a huge misnomer that I sit down and decide how many Republicans to interview. We draw a random sample of registered voters in the state. We contact them, and they tell us what their partisanship is. And if they are feeling a little more Republican, our data reflects that. Now, there are other things that can go on, like who answers the poll, though that has generally been less favorable to Republicans with a little less response from Republicans. But I don't control this. This is what the data says. And, you know, yes, it's a little higher than it has been, about a 5-point gap instead of about a 2-point gap. But I don't want to hear 55% when I didn't say 55%.
Excuse me, but it is a 5 percentage point difference.
Yes, and I've shown you that.
What would, if this were accurate of the population in Wisconsin who are going to be voting, what would cause them in the last month between your prior survey and this one to sort of move, to me, more significantly of saying, I'm a Republican?
Look, I'm sorry, we're running out of time, but look at this chart. There's not a big change of this over the year. It's been stable. There's a point or two shift. The margin of the error for the poll is 4 points. This is not the thing that's driving these results. And I've been as transparent as I know how to be about what our partisanship is and how it's changed. And it may be that on Election Day, it's +2 Democratic. I don't know. I can only tell you what my data says and faithfully report to you what my data shows. So it's not my choice what the partisan makeup is. There's something else?
Hello. First, I'd just like to say thank you for coming and speaking with us today. My question is, there's been a lot of criticism of some polling of other, I guess, agencies and whether they are or are not hurting their results to get a certain response. I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on that criticism?
Sure. This is the question of whether some pollsters look to see what the polling average is and move their results. There's been mixed evidence on that. There is some evidence that in some situations, primarily when there's been substantial polling in a state by supposed high-quality pollsters, that subsequent polls may appear to move closer to what that polling average is. That's been alleged, and there's been some evidence for it. I wouldn't say it's overwhelming, but some. The main issue is that if the election actually does move a little bit, and it seems to over the last month, then you would expect most polls to move a little bit in that direction. How do you distinguish herding from responding to changes in the environment? In our case, we had a 4-point Harris lead a month ago. We have a 1-point lead now. It's the same answer about partisan split. I don't control that. I'm just telling you what the data show. But you know, if the race really has tightened, you would expect polls to show that tightening of the race as well. So it's hard to ultimately prove. As I say, I think some analysis has shown some evidence of it. And as a professional, it worries me that's an element of it. The other side is the mix of polling that's being taken here at the end of the campaign, and how does that mix change from Republican to Democratic pollsters, internal, external polls, and so on. So it's complicated. I think there has been some evidence, but you've got to also agree that if the environment is shifting a little bit, you ought to see most polls shift in that direction. And we will know whether we were right or wrong next week, right? Because honestly, that is the ultimate advantage of doing election polling. If I was just telling you whether people like Tide or Cheer better, well, I could make more money in market research if I was doing that, but there's no ultimate answer for that. But we will know next week just how wrong I've been, right? And there will be plenty of people to bring that up and point it out. And I'm sure they'll rush to say if I was right as well. But the real point is, I would like you to believe that those fundamentals we talked about, the role of issues, the role of personality, are the revealing things from polling and the value of understanding what's going on in this race, more so than whether one candidate is 1 point ahead or 1 point behind, where we really can't have any confidence that that tells us who's going to win.
Shel?
When I entered law school, I joined the Young Republican Party, and I've been a good Republican ever since, until now. I have been appointed by Republican presidents and Jimmy Carter, the Democratic president. And I look at this election and kind of become nauseated. What's the matter with me?
You just aren't old enough and experienced enough yet, Shel. You need a few more years. Look, this is one of the more broad point is we've seen a profound change in American politics over the last 15 or 20 years. And some of it predates Trump and some of it follows Trump. We've seen this big shift from white non-college men being 4 points more Republican than Democrat to now being 25 points more Republican than Democrat. It's a big shift in the underlying makeup of the party. We've seen the nature of campaigns and campaign rhetoric change dramatically from the old days. And we're seeing this shift in the makeup of the parties that is shifting how the parties think of themselves, how they relate to others, and so on. To me, this is now pontificating. I think both parties have really suffered from not being able to speak to the other party's constituents. I think Democrats have a very hard time going into rural areas, look at the group crosstab, and telling a compelling story about what Democrats do for country folks. And Republicans have a terrible time coming into cities and into minority communities and saying, what do Republicans do for those communities and across all of those demographic groups where you see such a big divide? But listen to the rhetoric of the campaigns and how difficult they find it to genuinely pitch issues that might appeal to somebody not in their base group for the risk of offending their base group. Now, you always have to worry about who brung you, right? You got to stay attentive to your base and what your core constituency is. But I really think since the early 2000s, we saw both parties adopt base strategies, that it made more sense to worry about turning out your base voters and win with them than it did to try really hard to convince some people to cross party lines. And I think that has affected our politics all the way down to the local level. But I have no answer for how you change that other than candidates and maybe voters adopting a little more willingness to address these cross-boundary issues, or else we're just going to stay fighting between two bases that are almost equal in size, and big, profound differences come from who wins based on a swing of 80,000 votes across 4 states. So on that happy note, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.